Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our talk this morning on Puccini. 100 years or so, well, it's 100 years next year, since his death, which means he's a much more current opera writer than I had sort of imagined. I imagine they're all... You can't hear me.
Yes, we're just not.
I'll try again. Okay, I was just saying, it's Puccini's anniversary. In fact, it's next year, but we haven't got a festival next year, so it's this year. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Richard to talk to us about it. Puccini is one of his hobbies, enthusiasms. But Richard is a design engineer by profession, but he is also a singer and conducts choral choirs and so on. So we're greatly looking forward, Richard, to your talk this morning.
Well, thank you. Now, we all know who Puccini was. He's sort of the quintessential Italian opera composer. And I aim to dig more deeply into the man himself and his work. Now, what we can just hear is the sublime humming chorus from Madam Butterfly. And some people say opera is in fact the ultimate art form, gracefully reflecting the drama of life and encompassing all the arts: music, poetry, design, choreography, painting, acting, and more. Anyway, Giacomo Puccini was born in 1858 and died in 1924. So he spanned the latter half of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th. And the style of his composing changed during his life. His early work was very much based on the traditional romantic Italian opera. But later in his life, he effectively started a new form of opera called verismo, and we'll get into that later. His most famous operas, in the order in which he composed them, are Manosco, which was premiered when he was 34 in 1893, La Boheme when he was 38, Tosca when he was 42, Madam Butterfly about 4 years later, and then came La Fanciulla del West when he was 52, and El Trittico when he was 60, and lastly Turandot in 1924. And we'll have a brief look at most of them. Now, Puccini is frequently compared to Verdi, who preceded him by about 45 years. He was about 42, in fact, when Verdi died in 1901. So they overlapped, and they did actually meet. Now, Puccini was born in Lucca, in Tuscany, roughly in the middle of Italy. Lucca is about 40 miles from Florence, and even now it's surprisingly unspoiled. I was there a couple of weeks ago, and the medieval city walls are still there. It has a cathedral, but Puccini was born a stone's throw from the main city church of San Michele, and in a house in the corner of the Piazza Cittadella. This is the piazza, and I sat there with a glass of wine and did a pathetic quick watercolor of the house, and with the statue outside it. The imposing bronze statue sits in the piazza. Anyway, I then discovered to my embarrassment that actually that wasn't his house. His house was on the right. And it's now a museum. And in fact, it's sort of dedicated to, we've got lots of photos in it and music and letters and so on written by him and more. His parents were Michele Puccini and Albina Maggi, and they had 9 children, and he was the 5th, and he was named Giacomo, Antonio, Domenico, Michele, Secondo, Maria Puccini. And there was a strong family musical tradition. Giacomo's great-great-grandfather was Maestro di Cappella, that's the master of the choir, at the cathedral, and this position passed from father to son. But Giacomo himself was only 5 when his father died, so he couldn't continue that 124-year-old family tradition. He did sing in the cathedral as a choir boy. And when he was 14, he was also made a substitute organist. And actually, he wasn't particularly interested in music and was a pretty poor student. He was lazy and played truant a lot. He and his brother actually stole organ pipes from the church and sold them to pay for cigarettes. San Michele is the church close to the Puccini house, and he went to school at the seminary of San Michele with one of his uncles supervising his education. Lucca is now very much as Giacomo would remember it. And this glorious sort of oval piazza is where the Roman amphitheater was. And then when he was 18, he and his brother, because all the rest were sisters, walked 20 miles to Pisa to see a production of Aida by Verdi. And the boy was seriously impressed. And undoubtedly, it encouraged his journey to become one of the greatest opera composers of all time. He went on to attend the Puccini School of Music in Lucca, paid for by another uncle. And there he started composing. One of his firsts was a setting of the Credo of a Mass that got its first performance in 1878. And whilst working for his diploma, he spent more time on the Mass, actually finishing it as his graduation exercise. It's for choir with a tenor and baritone soloists, and was first performed in 1880, and he just hit 20. It was well received at the time, though surprisingly his next performance wasn't until 1952 in Chicago. Fleet Choral Society performed it in 1989 and again in 2015. I sing with them and love doing it. It's so enjoyable. Let's hear a bit of the second movement, the Gloria, which gives the work its title. The sopranos and altos start, and then the whole choir joins in gloriously. I think that shows a young, lively, and an amazingly confident view of music, and pretty impressive for someone so young. His newfound excitement of music now spurred him on, and when he was 21, he was admitted to the Milan Conservatoire. The fees were paid by another of his uncles, and there he was, of course, steeped in music, actually sharing a room with Pietro Mascagni, who went on to compose Cavaliera Rusticana, and the Conservatoire is still going strong, but Puccini's severe lack of money made this a very difficult time for him. Even so, he was soon composing more, and while at the conservatory, he wrote an orchestral piece called Capriccio Sinfonico as a thesis composition. And one of his teachers, a chap called Ponchielli, who was a composer of operas himself, was so impressed he had it performed at a student concert in 1883. This and the Gloria we heard a bit of, with, in the end, the only non-operatic compositions he ever produced. His first real opera was Le Villi. It was a graduation piece from the Milan Conservatoire, and Le Villi means the fairies. It was based on a short story by the Paris-born Jean-Baptiste Carre. In fact, Carre bases an older European folk legend on which the ballet Giselle was also based. And Puccini found a librettist called Ferdinando Fontana. Some friends got together and subsidized the first performance, which turned out to be a great success. Puccini's mother received a telegram on the night of its premiere in May 1884. Theatre packed, immense success. Anticipations exceeded, 18 calls, and the finale of first act encored thrice. And this led Verdi's publisher, Giulio Ricordi, to take Puccini on. And this actually was the start of a crucial part of Puccini's life, as Ricordi's name is on virtually all of Puccini's music from then on. Puccini in particular, Giulio Ricordi himself became something of a father figure, feared and often needing to complain about Puccini's work habits, but deeply trusted. And following that promising first opera, Giulio Ricordi commissioned another one. And Puccini started working on it soon after the premiere of Le Vedi. Broadly, the words have to come first. So Ferdinando Fontana was asked to create the libretto again. And the result was Edgar, which got a tepid reception. The premiere was in La Scala in Milan in 1889, and Puccini rewrote it at least twice, reducing 4 acts to 3, but it hasn't stood the test of time. Puccini eventually gave up on it and hated it, and blaming Fontana for the poor libretto. Despite the failure of Edgar, Ricordi paid for Puccini to visit Bayreuth to hear Wagner's Die Meistersinger, and it was there he began to plan his next work. It was Manon Lescaut. And this time he decided to write the libretto himself, so no fool of a librettist could spoil it. Even so, Ricordi persuaded him to accept the famous and very experienced Leon Cavallo as his librettist. But Puccini soon asked Ricordi to remove him from the project. 4 other librettists were then involved with the opera, as Puccini constantly changed his mind about how he wanted the piece to be structured. And it was almost by accident that the final 2, Luigi Illica and Giuseppe Giacosa, came together to complete the opera. Ricordi, however, stuck with Puccini, even giving him an allowance. And Manon Lescaut was premiered at the Teatro Regio in Turin in 1893. Puccini was now 35. The plot is from a French novel that was first published in 1731, possibly the first to have a prostitute as its heroine. And it was initially banned in France as being scandalous and immoral, until it was toned down for an edition about 20 years later. And the title of the book was The Story of the Chevalier des Grieux and Manon Lescaut. Des Grieux falls hopelessly in love with Manon and gives up his noble and landed family to run away with her and live in blissful cohabitation in Paris. But he runs out of money, and Manon loves luxury. So to keep her satisfied, he borrows from friends and even cheats gamblers. But eventually, Manon runs off with a richer man. Things don't go well for her, and she's convicted for being a prostitute and is deported to Louisiana. Des Grieux manages to go with her, and pretending they're married, they again live idyllically for a time. And he then approaches the governor to ask permission to marry Manon. But the governor's son finds out and aims to get her for himself. Des Grieux challenges him to a duel and knocks him unconscious. And thinking he may have killed him, the 2 lovers run off into the wilderness, where Manon dies of exposure and exhaustion. And there Des Grieux buries his beloved. So a Puccini heroine dies. Here is an aria from the first act from a 2014 Royal Opera House production with Jonas Kaufmann as Des Grieux. He's remembering the first time he set eyes on Manon. The emotion is obvious. The opera was an immediate and unqualified triumph with both audiences and critics. Puccini took 30 curtain calls on the opening night. He celebrated by buying himself a bicycle, which he paid for in monthly installments. The publisher Ricordi around this time was a huge enterprise, and Puccini was not easy to work with, and the directors actually considered severing their association with him. But then Manon was a great success and set Puccini up as the most promising composer of his generation. Bernard Shaw said, "Puccini looks to me more like the heir of Verdi than any of his rivals." And the librettists Illica and Giacomo shared the success too, and stayed with Puccini for his next 3 operas. The reception of Manon allowed Puccini to settle all of his debts that he built up, and even to buy a rundown old house at Torre del Lago near Lucca. Now, we've touched on some of the women in his operas, but I'd better mention the real ones in his life. You'll remember that his father died when he was only 5, and his mother's influence from then on was strong, although she herself died just before he was 26. At about that time, he was given piano lessons in Lucca to a married woman called Elvira. There she is, and they started a relationship. Her own marriage was not a happy one, and within a year, she was pregnant by Puccini. And when her condition became obvious, they escaped to live in Monza to avoid gossip. And Monza's now a suburb of Milan. And it was here that their son Antonio was born. And he would be Elvira and Puccini's only child. Elvira herself already had a daughter called Tosca, and all 4 of them lived there together. And they were there for nearly 2 years. Puccini's granddaughter has now restored the house, and Monza remembers him with honor. There's a via Giacomo Puccini named in his honor, but then there's a via in Milan with the same name, and Cagliari, and Pisa, and Pescara, and Trieste. I could go on for a long time. He is not forgotten. Levilli, Edgar, and Manon Lescaut define Puccini's early opera career. And we now move to his middle career with Tosca, La Boheme, and Madam Butterfly. He's now in his 40s. Tosca, with a libretto, again by Illica and Giacomo, has become a hugely popular grand opera. Its premiere in Rome in 1900 was a national event, with the Prime Minister and much of the cabinet, and even Queen Margherita, in attendance. And about 10 years previously, Puccini had seen a French play called La Tosca, and he took to the story. And after several years of argument, finally bought the rights. And he then had frequent disagreements with Illica and Giacomo while turning the French script into an Italian opera. It's a melodramatic piece set in Rome in 1800, with the Kingdom of Naples, control of Rome, threatened by Napoleon's invasion of Italy. And it contains depictions of torture and murder and suicide, along with some of Puccini's best-known lyrical arias. The main characters are the celebrated singer Tosca herself, and Cavaradossi, a painter, and Scarpia, who is the chief of police. And the sanctimonious and villainous Scarpia promises Tosca that if she lets him have her way with her, he'll let her convicted lover, that's Cavaradossi, live. And she manages to secure a guarantee that Cavaradossi's execution will be faked. And she then kills Scarpia, but the firing squad doesn't fire blanks after all, and Cavaradossi dies. Tosca is distraught and copes with the loss of her love by leaping off the Castels de Sant'Angelo to her death. Yet another Puccini heroine's life cut short. The critics disliked it, saying it was a facile melodrama with plenty of confusions of plot. But the musicologist Joseph Kerman calls it a shabby little shocker. But the public loved it, and it's now become one of the most frequently performed operas. What it did was to establish a type of operatic style called verismo, meaning realistically truthful. The main aim was to present all of real life not shying away from ugliness and vulgarity and the violent and the erotic even and the sadistic, but depicting realistically all aspects of life. In fact, Puccini's college flatmate, Mascagni, had kick-started the approach with Cavaliera Rusticana, followed by Leon Covaglio's Pagliacci. They're both short operas and are often done together, and therefore nicknamed Cav and Pag. But Puccini's Tosca is the first full-length opera in Verismo style. His next one is La Boheme. The story was based on Henri Murger's novel, Scènes de la vie de Bohème, Scenes from the Bohemian Life, and a series of vignettes of life in the Quartier Latin in the 1840s. And the opera was premiered in Turin in 1896, conducted by the young Toscanini. And the critics again were dismissive. In 1951, Benjamin Britten actually said, "After 4 or 5 performances, I never wanted to hear Bohème again. In spite of its neatness, I became sickened by the cheapness and the emptiness of the music." But the rest of us love it. Irresistible in its witty, passionate blend of comedy and tragedy, the opera focuses on the lives of 2 groups of young artists as they eke out an existence in the poverty fringes of Paris. Rodolfo, a penniless poet, meets Mimi, a seamstress, and they fall instantly in love. But their happiness is threatened when he learns that Mimi is gravely ill. And Puccini himself said, "I put my entire soul into La Bohème. There are no words to describe how strongly I fall in love with the characters that I've created." It has become one of the most frequently performed operas worldwide, including another sad end for a woman. Here comes a highlight from the end of Act 1, which is a high point in the romance of the music. The sweeping melodies and swelling orchestra captures that all-encompassing feeling of becoming intoxicated by another person, and of that other person feeling the same. O suave fanciulla means, O lovely maiden. A couple of years before Manon, he was spending a lot of time at the village called Torre del Lago. It's on the coast, about 15 miles from Lucca. And this was then a small fishing community. It's a very pleasant area. And by 1900, when he was just over 40 and with significant profits from La Bohème, he had bought some land and built a villa by the lake. He'd started going there after his mother died to find a bit of solace. And he soon became dedicated to the lake beside the sea and the villa that he built there. He loved the place where he could continue composing, but also indulge his passion for boating on the lake and for hunting and for fast cars. He said of himself, "I'm a mighty hunter of wildfowl, operatic librettos, and attractive women." He and Elvira were to stay there for the rest of his life, in fact. Some of Puccini's friends from Milan visited him at Torre del Lago, and they liked the country life so much that some of them even stayed for 5 years. They referred to themselves as the Bohemians and built a small wooden cabin in the garden with a sign over the door that read Le Club de Bohème. And there they would sit for hours talking about hunting and fishing and beautiful women and music. And while drinking fine wines and eating local delicacies, all at Puccini's expense, of course. The success of Manon gave Puccini the money to buy a de Dion Bouton, which he hugely enjoyed, racing through the streets and arousing admiration and awe, as well as some speeding fines. This is the start of a passion for fast cars, one of the luxuries of success and wealth. However, in 1903, Puccini was seriously injured in a car accident during a nighttime journey on the road from Lucca to Torre. The car was driven by Puccini's chauffeur and was carrying Puccini, Elvira, and their son Antonio. And it became a national news story. The car went off the road, fell several meters, and flipped over. Puccini was trapped under the vehicle with severe fractures of his right leg, and with a portion of the car on top of him, with the engine still running. Elvira and Antonio were flung from the car and escaped with minor injuries. A doctor living near the scene managed to extract Puccini from the wreckage. The injury did not heal well, and Puccini remained under treatment for a long time. He was in hospital for months and usually walked with a stick there afterwards. And he was being looked after by Elvira and Tosca. Curiously, the day after the accident, Elvira's real husband was murdered by the husband of a woman with whom he was having an affair. And this allowed Puccini to marry Elvira, which they did in 1904. And while he was laid up with his leg, he was working hard on his next opera, Madame Butterfly. Its premiere was to be just a year after the accident. The plot for this one came from a short story by the American John Luther Long, being published a few years earlier, which is itself based on an 1887 French novel. By the way, it's often called Madame Butterfly, but that's just the Italian for Madam. The smart title, it's not a brothel keeper. Even so, it's perhaps the most sordid story in the operatic canon. Lieutenant Pinkerton, who is a naval officer from the USS Lincoln, is posted to Japan. And while there, aided by Goro, an unscrupulous Japanese marriage broker, he lures the fatherless, impoverished 15-year-old Jocho-san, her name is Japanese for butterfly, into a temporary union. And assuming that she's legally married, Butterfly abandons her, her Buddhist faith for Christianity and is consequently renounced by her family and friends. And despite his strong attraction to her and the warnings of the local US consul, Sharpless, Pinkerton then deserts Butterfly, but tells her he will return and take her to America later. 3 years of waiting pass, during which time Butterfly secretly gives birth to their child. And when Pinkerton does finally return to Japan, it's with his real wife, American wife, Kate. And on discovering the existence of his son, they decide to take the child from Butterfly and take him back to America. Butterfly sadly agrees to what she sees as a better life for her son. And she then kills herself, so that her son will not be tormented in his later life by his mother's abandonment. It is a powerful story, and Puccini produced some powerful music. And just like the story, the music is a fusion of East and West, as well as delicate Oriental colors in the orchestration. Puccini weaves in traditional Eastern tunes, which are associated with Jocho-san, whereas Pinkerton is characterized by snippets from the Star-Spangled Banner. The opera's big hit is Un bel dì, One Fine Day, in which the waiting Jocho-san describes what it will be like when Pinkerton finally returns. And it opens with a hushed soprano line floating high above the orchestra, just like the smoke on the horizon from the returning ship. But the aria gathers incredible force and passion, showing Butterfly's strength and determination. Here it's sung by Ying Huang, who is in fact a Chinese operatic soprano. Butterfly got its premiere at La Scala in Milan in 1904. Surprisingly, it was a disaster and was promptly withdrawn. Puccini rewrote it and it was put on next in Brescia about 3 months later. And this time it was a great success. The public and the critics can be so fickle. Even so, he rewrote it 3 more times before the 5th version in 1907, which is now known as the standard one. And this was premiered at the Met with Enrico Caruso as Pinkerton and Geraldine Farah as Cho-Cho-san, and with Puccini in attendance. Puccini was getting richer and enjoyed spending his money on traveling. And a year after he and Elvira married, they went to Buenos Aires. And in 1908, they went to Egypt. But over those few years, Elvira was growing increasingly unhappy due to the numerous other women that Puccini became involved with. It was said he concentrated on women on stage and off stage as well. And it was not uncommon for the maestro to fall in love when he was composing. He called these little amorettes his little gardens. And in 1900, while working on Butterfly, Puccini fell for a young girl he met in Turin, and he nicknamed her Corinna. And he was so obsessed with her that Elvira, in despair, seriously thought of leaving him. Matters reached a climatic drama when in 1909, Elvira's jealousy boiled over, which led her to accuse their shy servant girl named Doria Manfredi at Toledo Lago of having an affair with her husband, openly and publicly calling her a filthy whore. She is seducing my husband in my own home. Sooner or later, I will drown her in the lake. And as a result of this, the distraught Doria killed herself by ingesting poison. And her last words were, "Don't blame the maestro for what I had done." And after a medical examination proved that she was in fact a virgin, the family brought charges of slander against Elvira. And angry at what Elvira had done, Puccini sent her away to live in Milan. She was eventually tried and found guilty of slander and defamation and sentenced to 5 months in prison. But Puccini relented, taking Elvira back and paying a huge sum to the Manfredi family to drop the charges. You have to admit, it sounds rather like a Puccini opera. He was humiliated by these events and didn't manage to produce another opera for several years. Not that he was wholly innocent. He was at the time actually having an affair, not with poor Doria, but with her cousin, Giulia. And she was a barmaid at the local tavern just opposite the villa at Torre del Lago. And they even had a child out of wedlock called Alfredo, who only died in 1998. Puccini's last lover was Rose Ada in 1921, when he was 53. In 1910, arguably the last phase of his composing life came with his last opera called La Fortuna del West, The Girl of the Golden West. Again, it seems an odd subject, but explained perhaps by the fact that it was commissioned by the New York Metropolitan Opera and were premiered there with a cast, again, including Enrico Caruso. And like Butterfly, it was based on an American play, also by Velasco. Puccini was very proud of it, reckoning it was one of his greatest works. The critics certainly liked the impressive orchestration and the way it's musically well integrated. However, history has proved it less successful than his other operas, and it's rarely performed now. The story takes place during the gold rush in a Californian mine. It involves Wells Fargo agents and sheriffs and gangs and card cheats, posses and pistol shootings and more. The female character is Minnie, who works in the bar in which most of the action takes place, and which actually seems based curiously on the ill-fated Doria Manfredi. She has a complicated time with the men, and finally manages to persuade them not all to hang her love, Dick Johnson, who turned out to be a notorious bandit. He and Minnie leave California to start a new life together. Yes, uniquely, a Puccini heroine survives. Puccini went on to New York in 1910 to supervise the premiere at the Met, and we have a recording made over 100 years ago of his, and in fact Elvira's, actual voices.
Ringrazio con tutto cuore l'egregio signor Biafora per le gentili parole pronunziate. Sono veramente grato al gran pubblico di New York per le accoglienze tanto entusiastiche che ha fatto alle mie opere. Accetto l'augurio del buon viaggio e finisco gridando America Forever!
Da parte mia, lieta per gli onori tributati a mio marito, lascio un saluto ed un caldo ringraziamento a tutti, e specialmente alle gentili signore americane che furono tanto cortesi verso di noi.
And then in 1912, Giulio Ricordi died. And although his company continued from strength to strength, Puccini lost his most valuable friend. La Fortuna was followed by La Rondine, a take on a Viennese comic operetta. La Rondine means the swallow. It was commissioned by the Vienna Karltheater, and its premiere was in 1917, in the middle of the First World War, which was obviously an inconvenient time for new works to appear. Puccini tried to sell the opera to Ricordi, but they declined. It's rarely performed now, but this is Tesco's in Cromwell Road. That's what's actually called a flash mob. And in this case, it was probably Holland Park Opera trying to attract an audience. His next one was Il Trittico, and again it's an odd idea. 3 one-act operas put together. Each part was a different story from Dante's Divine Comedy. And Ricordi was not enthusiastic, but Puccini insisted, and it received its world premiere at the Met in 1918. Its Italian premiere in Rome 2 months later, and about a year after La Rondine, and he was 60 then. It too wasn't particularly well liked. The 3 parts are Il Tabarro, Suor Angelica, and Gianni Schicchi. Il Tabarro is very dark and brooding, full of violence and grit, very much as we expect from Verismo opera. Suor Angelica was Puccini's personal favorite and is an uplifting tale of religious redemption. And Gianni Schicchi is a farce full of greed and conniving. In fact, the ROH did put on the full set in 2016. And here is their 30-second long trailer. Puccini wanted them to be performed as a set of 3 and campaigned bitterly to Ricordi when they gave permission for just the last 2 to be performed by the Royal Opera House in 1920. He said, "I very much dislike Trittico being given in bits." In fact, they're not often performed together nowadays, though Gianni Schicchi is quite often put on, usually paired with other works such as Cab and Pag. The action of Gianni Schicchi takes place in Donati's bedroom immediately after his death, as his greedy relatives feign grief and search for his will. The mood shifts to anger when the relatives discover they've all been disinherited, and they seek out the clever and resourceful Schicchi to make a counterfeit will. Schicchi, however, turns the scheme against them, bequeathing most of the dead man's fortune to himself, while the relatives, realizing that they're parties to a crime of forgery, are forced to sit by silently. Gianni Schicchi has one of Puccini's most famous tunes, O mio babino caro, meaning, O my beloved father. And here it is sung when it got its Italian premiere by Frances Alda, actually in February 1919. So this recording was made about 104 years ago. Actually, I've got a slightly more recent recording by one of our current celebrities. Oh, sorry about that. I couldn't really resist it. Right, I've lost my spade, please. So Puccini is obviously a complicated person. Oh, this should work. There we are. There we are. Who created some of the world's greatest music. And it's clear he had a fascination, almost an obsession with suffering women. The author of a critical biography by Moscow Kana has worked out this really comes from a mother fixation. You may remember his father died when he was 5, and he had a domineering mother, making him feel guilty at the idea of even conceiving love for other women. So he portrays women as inferior, and in fact punishing them for being loved. They're often victims of cruel destiny and of melancholy, and have a constant feeling of inadequacy, and almost invariably come to a sad end. Then when he was about 63, he started Turandot. Puccini never pronounced the final T himself. The tragic events of Elvira and the falsely accused girl who committed suicide stayed with Puccini, and again a hint of that appears in Turandot. In fact, Puccini hadn't finished the opera when he died, and it was completed by a chap called Franco Alfano about 2 years later. And Toscanini conducted the premiere at La Scala that year. As you might imagine, it's an excuse for some elaborate stage sets and costumes. And the fate of Doria, that servant girl at Torre del Lago, is remembered as he invents a character called Liu, a slave girl who at the end of her aria commits suicide. The plot is based on an ancient Persian story. Again, an odd one as a plot of an opera. It's set in China and involves Prince Caliph, who falls in love with the cold Princess Turandot. And to obtain permission to marry her, a suitor has to solve 3 riddles. Any wrong answer results in death. But Caliph passes the test. But Turandot still refuses to marry him. He then offers her a way out if she's able to learn his name before dawn the next day, and at daybreak he will die. Here is a short bit from a lavish Met production. It's from near the end of the opera, and I'm sure you recognize the music. Puccini was a chain smoker, both of cigarettes and also of his favorite Toscano cigars. But in 1923, he started to complain of a chronic sore throat. He was advised to gargle with salt water, with milk, and with honey, and even raw eggs. It didn't improve, and finally he was diagnosed with throat cancer. And the doctor suggested he go to Brussels for a new experimental treatment with radiation therapy. Puccini and Elvira were never actually told how serious it was. Only his son Antonio actually knew. The treatment was invasive, and with Puccini, it created complications of uncontrolled bleeding. He was in Brussels for about a month, working when he was able to on Turandot. The Italian ambassador came to see him every day. But Puccini couldn't speak because of the radium needles in his throat. And then he had a heart attack. He was 65. He was able to write on a piece of paper the words, "My poor Elvira, my poor wife," and raised his hand as if to salute Antonio and Tosca, who were at his bedside, before his head fell on its side for the last time. News of his death reached Rome during a performance of La Boheme, which was immediately stopped, and the orchestra played Chopin's funeral march to the stunned audience. Brussels gave him a major funeral.
Giacomo Puccini died on November 29, 1924 in Brussels. He was 65. Elvira survived him by 6 years. The Belgians gave him a state funeral. His body was eventually returned to Torre del Lago, where it remains to this day in a private chapel in the Villa Puccini.
At the funeral in Milan Cathedral, Toscanini conducted the La Scala Choir and the orchestra, where they performed the Requiem from Edgar. And then later at the premiere of Turandot, Toscanini ended it where Puccini had left it unfinished, on a single high E flat, played by the piccolo at Liu's funeral procession. And he then said quietly, "Here the opera ends, left unfinished for the death of the maestro." There followed a deafening silence before Antonio and Tosca went on stage to hug Toscanini. Puccini was initially buried in Milan, and his body was put in Toscanini's family tomb, until it was moved about 2 years later to the specially created private chapel his son had built inside the Puccini villa at Torre del Lago. His body is still there, along with Elvira's, who survived him by about 6 years. And when he died, he'd become the most commercially successful opera composer of all time, worth around $200 million. And Elvira inherited that huge estate. And this passed to his son, Antonio. And when he died in 1946, it passed to his wife, Rita, who squandered it on the French Riviera with her freeloading brother. And as a postscript, a few months ago, Simonetta died at 89. She was the last surviving child of Giacomo, and her real mother's name was another of Giacomo's affairs, was not given in the court case that proved that she really was a genuine descendant. And she got a proportion of what was left of the vast financial estate, but by this time, most of it had been frittered away. And she spent much of her life in keeping the Puccini flame alight. In the court case, in fact, she did win the ownership of the lakeside villa at Torre del Lago. And in 1996, she set up the Friends of the Homes of Giacomo Puccini and raised money to restore the villa and create the museum there. And there's now a huge open-air auditorium close to the house, and where they have a Puccini festival. So we come to the end of the story of Giacomo Puccini's life, full of drama and the creator of world-class music, which I'm sure will be enjoyed for many years to come. And remarkably, only 2 or 3 of his operas failed. And I think the reason for this is that he didn't imitate and copy the music of others very much, but he never shocked either by writing anything entirely new. What he did have was a strong sense of what the human voice could achieve and what works on a stage. So I hope I've introduced you to some facts and stories about this rather amazing man. Thank you for listening. Yes, if anybody's got any questions, do come up and have a chat.
What an interesting man. What an interesting talk. Richard, you brought him to life for us. So, thank you so much for a most entertaining walk.